So in this video, we're going to talk about public opinion and how to measure public opinion, different types of polls. So we're going to roll through these first few slides pretty quickly, discussing public opinion and what it is, and then we'll talk about polls. So public opinion involves two main components. So first is an individual's own beliefs, and then the blending of those individual preferences into a larger concept. Okay, so an individual's beliefs about government and politics and the role of government, and then the blending of those preferences into this larger concept, this larger opinion. So if elected officials don't know what citizens want, they have a really hard time representing them. So that's where these polls are going to come in. Elected officials will use different types of polls and other ways of measuring public opinion in order to represent their constituents. So what's meant by public opinion? There's two different perspectives. The first is that the average citizen doesn't have or isn't able to express meaningful opinions on a vast array of issues facing the country. So the idea that the average American just doesn't have enough information on a lot of issues concerning Americans in order to have a real opinion about those issues. And two, even though individuals sometimes lack the information they need to form opinions, they can make inferences based on cues from political ideology, peers, or political parties. So maybe a person doesn't have a ton of information on certain topics, but they can gather that information from other areas and make inferences. So what do Americans know about politics? A 1996 survey found that a significant amount of Americans were not able to answer basic questions about American government. Younger Americans, low-income Americans, and members of racial and ethnic minorities fared the worst in answering those questions. So a lot of Americans don't have a real understanding of how the government works and the different issues concerning our government and politics. So a more optimistic view, individuals' experiences and interaction with the government over time can help them make sense of an issue or problem. A gut rationality, so going with your gut, can assist in making political choices. Voters might use their identification with a political party when evaluating candidates and forming opinions. So oftentimes voters might stick with their party when they vote for somebody. They might not know a lot about a candidate, so they just go with their party. And there's a possibility of wisdom of crowds where people can assess a problem or situation as a group. So together they can form some sort of political consensus or opinion on certain issues or topics. So that's a little bit about public opinion. Let's get into measuring public opinion and the different ways government officials are going to try to measure the opinion of the American people of their constituents. So requirements for an effective representation in democracy is that voters have opinions that can be expressed to elected officials, and elected officials need to respond to these preferences. Okay, so in order for democracy to be effective, voters or constituents need to express their opinion about certain issues, certain topics, and then those elected officials representing those constituents need to respond. So first is an election, and that is an ideal way to understand a citizen's preferences. Okay, so you can see a citizen's preferences based on the outcome of election. However, instead of waiting on election results and trying to decipher them, officials tend to want to go directly to citizens about what they want. So this is where public opinion polls and focus groups are going to come in. So one method of measuring public opinion is that focus group. And this is a small group of individuals assembled for a conversation about specific issues. So for example here. So focus groups involve a small group of people who participate in a structured discussion to discover insight into public opinion, usually led by a moderator, and it's often limited to specific issues, but they can provide quality data and insight into voter perceptions of political issues. But you're not going to get a whole lot of statistics from a focus group. This is where you have polling, okay? So polling comes in, your scientific polling. So a scientific poll is a representative poll of randomly selected respondents with a statistically significant sample size using neutral language. Okay, so it's not possible to give a survey to every member of a large population. So to the entire United States, for example, that would be very difficult to do. So for this reason, political scientists are going to choose that sample, that smaller group, to study and make predictions about the larger population. So, representative poll of randomly selected respondents with statistically significant sample size. In other words, you're going to be selecting a subset of a constituency, so a portion of the United States, for example, and asking carefully written questions to members of the group. Okay, so here are your 5 steps to conducting that scientific poll. So defining the population, constructing a sample, preparing valid questions, selecting the control and the means by which the poll will be taken, and then reporting your findings. So how polling works. So a valid scientific poll is going to require random selection, okay? And that refers to the individuals chosen by chance to be part of the study. You might also see this as random sample as well. And this means that everyone who is an appropriate subject of the poll has an equal chance of being selected for the survey. Okay, so everyone must have an equal probability for selection for being chosen to participate in this poll. And the goal of this is to minimize the uncertainty about true opinion as much as possible without taking too much time or costing too much money. And you also want to get that representative sample, which is going to reflect the demographics of the population. Okay, so we want it to be a very accurate and proportional poll that mirrors the population that is being surveyed. All right, so how polling works. Pollsters sometimes use weighting to adjust the results of a poll based on percentages of different groups participating in the survey and the demographics of the larger population. When a poll is complete and the results are printed, it is also going to include a sampling error, and this can also be heard of as the margin of error, and this describes the potential discrepancy between the poll results and the opinions of the larger population that's being measured. So the sampling error is usually plus or minus a few points. And usually the numbers expressed in a survey are within 3 points. So in a presidential election, if one candidate receives 49% of the vote and the other receives 47%, that poll would be too close to call, or that election would be too close to call. So there are a few different types of polls that can be used to measure public opinion. First is an entrance survey, and these are given to individuals before voting takes place to predict the outcome of election and determine voter reasoning, so people who are coming in to vote, for example. Exit polls are surveys that are conducted following an event or at a polling place after people have voted, and this is to predict the winners of elections and collect data about how voters made their decisions. A benchmark poll is taken at the beginning of a political campaign to gauge support for the candidate and determine important issues. Okay, so this is used to reveal attitudes that citizens have about a candidate or about issues. Then you have tracking polls, and these determine the level of support for a candidate or an issue over time. So this would be taken at different intervals, okay, measuring the same data over time. And then random digit dialing uses telephone numbers randomly generated by a computer to select potential survey respondents. Now, there can be problems with polls, okay, so some things to keep in mind in terms of scientific polls. So the first is question order or sequencing, so the types of questions that follow other questions. Another would be question wording. That can affect results. So question wording could potentially intentionally guide respondents to a specific answer. So in those scientific polls, you want questions to be concise and worded in a neutral language, avoiding any kind of way of influencing responses. And you want vocabulary to be very simple and straightforward. Interviewers themselves can also affect results because surveys don't always reflect how strongly an individual feels about an issue. Oftentimes, surveys are going to really give respondents, it doesn't really give them a chance to share any kind of opinion, okay? So they can also affect results that way. So the effects of public opinion. So the single most effective predictor of public opinion is a person's identification with political party. Okay, so your opinion usually is going to align with every political party you identify with. Public opinion is often divided along gender lines. So men and women might have different opinions over different issues. And public opinion can also be divided on the basis of racial and ethnic identity. So, how are polls used? Public opinion polling is used by researchers, candidates, elected officials, and interest groups and the media who are all interested in viewpoints about the government and policy. So, elected officials are going to use polling to figure out what the public wants and also use it to determine how to spin their policy decisions to the public. So, they're going to use polling to understand how the public feels about proposed or existing public policies. They're going to help. It's going to help officials understand what problems are important to the public and what solutions are favored. And it's also going to influence politicians because they're concerned with re-election. Okay, so polling data could influence how they run their campaign. So public opinion and policy making. It's really difficult to measure the degree to which public opinion shapes legislation passed by Congress just because Congress is influenced by so many factors. And we discussed that during the Congress unit. So different factors that members of Congress consider when they go to vote. And then congressmen might choose to ignore public opinion because of the results gained over time. So sometimes members of Congress might look at the bigger picture instead of what's happening right now. They might look at how policy can affect years to come. Okay, so they might look at the bigger picture instead of what's happening right now. And it can also depend on whether members of Congress see themselves as a delegate or trustee. Okay, so do they see themselves as making decisions for their constituents or making decisions themselves using their knowledge? So that can depend how much they consider public opinion as well. And that's where we're going to stop with this lesson.